What's up, guys, and welcome back to the podcast. Robbie here. I just wanted to add this message at the start before we jump into it. I was delighted to welcome on Ogie Hollywood. Ogie is a friend of mine from Bali, and he is a huge mental health advocate. In this podcast, we talk at the start, we go into detail on responsibility, purpose, and we talk a bit around about business and creating your own business or starting your own business and what that's like. And then as we go through it, we really go into Ogie's personal story, and we speak on his own mental health battles and some of the obstacles that he had to overcome to put himself in the position that he's in. So it's an inspiring story for sure when you really take into account all of the things that he'd been through. And yeah, I just wanted to preface this podcast because at the start we do talk a bit about business, but as we go through it, we really dig deep into the personal experiences and the story behind it. So hopefully you enjoy it. Really enjoyed making this one myself. And was delighted to have Ogie on, and I would love to hear your feedback on it. So, Og, how are things? Thanks for jumping on, man.
Yeah, very good, Robbie. Cheers for having me on, mate.
No, it's been a long time in the works. I know I contacted you last year, and then obviously the way things went, it wasn't a right time to do it at the time. So, but we can get into that later on. But you're still out in Bali.
Yeah, still based in Bali, man. Been here for just over 2 years at this stage. Didn't plan to stay this long, to be honest. When I initially came, I thought it was going to be a short stopover on my way to Australia, but things have obviously conspired in a different direction, and calling it a bit of a base for now.
Is that why? Was that the plan initially? It was to chill out there for a small while and then move on to Melbourne or Sydney or one of those?
Yeah, kind of. Like originally, pre-COVID, I'd kind of quit my job in Dublin and had planned to move to Sydney, had visas and all sorted. And then whenever COVID kicked off, I obviously couldn't travel at the time, and very fortunately managed to keep my job. I was literally on the last week of my notice period before finishing up whenever COVID all kicked off. Kept my job in Dublin, and due to the circumstances that kind of unfolded, I was allowed access to work remotely around Europe. So spent the guts of that year, to be honest, about 9 or 10 months working initially in Portugal for like 3 months, and then went to Greece, then Tenerife, and kind of spent, I guess, got a bit of a taste for that sense of like working remotely or working abroad, but still with the comfort of having a decent salary and a full-time job. And whenever they kind of came to call us back to Dublin, it was like, look, we're going back to the office, COVID's still around, but we need to kind of move back to office based, and you can no longer be in Europe. I kind of said, look, I really appreciate it and what they've kind of done for me over the last year, but it's kind of my time to take the leap and go. I guess that plan kind of got pushed off. And whenever I did move here originally, Australia was still closed at the time, so the border was still locked, whereas Bali was open. I got a visa for here for 2 years. I kind of said, look, let's kind of come and see what happens. And the rest has kind of unfolded in lots of different ways. Yeah,
it's and the funny thing is, I know we I guess we met in Bali originally, but we crossed paths, or we should have crossed paths really in Tenerife, but we never came face to face. I don't think we were at the same house party at one stage, if I remember.
At that time. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it?
Were you? Was it when you were in Tenerife that you were still? Had you started the business at that stage, or were you still working with Google at that stage?
No, I was still at Google at that stage. I think maybe, I'm not sure. I quit Google. It would have been like March or roughly March of that year, and I stayed in Tenerife for another month after finishing up, just before going back to Ireland. I think I came out here in May. So it was kind of the end of that Google time, and then venturing into doing my own stuff. But at that stage, when I had nothing set up, to be honest, I was, even when I finished up in Google, I had no real avenue to make money. It was kind of like, look, I had a bit of savings put away. I was happy to kind of just roll the dice to an extent to see what happened and see where I went. I initially had one idea, man. I was trying to set up pretty much like a fitness retreat company. I'd met a guy in Greece who ran a couple of gyms over there, real nice guy, Letherius. And we got chatting whenever I was there, November, December of that year. And he was like, look, be very interesting to see if we could bring people over here. We got connections with a guy who ran kind of a Airbnb management company. He had some absolutely incredible, like 6, 7, 8 bedroom villas. So we kind of had everything lined up to do that. And that was my initial plan whenever I left. Like, I'll give this a bit of a crack as a kind of a passion project. All been very interested in fitness, obviously interested in travel and bringing people together. And spent the guts of kind of 6 months working on that and had everything lined up. We had a villa kind of booked for the first retreat in the September of that year. And then everything just fell flat as ours, to be honest. We couldn't get too many sign-ups. COVID was still knocking around Europe at the time, so travel wasn't too easy. Kind of kicked that one in the bucket after 6 months of kind of grafting on it. But it was a learning on the journey, I guess. One of the many failures I've had.
I think you need those, though, don't you? You need, because they set you up for a lot of times as well, like what I say to people, like before I started the mobility tutor, I had little things that I was trying out and different things like e-commerce, stuff like that, different type of coaching services. But it's something that I think you need to go through that phase to really kind of figure out what suits you or what fits you. How did you find that transition then from when you finished up work initially to coming to run the agency? How did you find that transition? Like, was it something that once you figured out, okay, I can do or like I can start to work on the agency, this is something that I look to build from now on? Or was there still a bit like, even when you had started the agency, were you feeling, is this the right thing for me? Is there something that I can commit to?
It's a very good question. I think it all kind of came through. In some ways, it was natural, but other ways, it was kind of thought out. Initially, whenever I was leaving in the first place, not necessarily before coming here, I was very keen on moving into a startup in like a smaller company, but into a more senior position. So my initial kind of idea was go into kind of a mid-level sales manager position or into a kind of mid-level marketing managerial position within a kind of like tech startup sort of scene within Sydney. And a big part of that was coming from a sense of, if I'm leaving a very good job in Google, I need to step into something that's better, or I'm going to make similar kind of money and I feel like it's a step in the right direction for my career. And I think a lot of that, in honesty, came from a bit of a sense of like, I don't know, like I guess what other people were going to think I was doing, as opposed to what I really wanted to do deep down. And I remember a lot of people asking me kind of when it was coming up to the last couple of months before finishing, it was always, what are you going to do next? And not having anything to do next always felt a bit like, oh, I'm actually not really sure. And I guess I wasn't secure enough in myself to sit within that and kind of say like, I'm just going to take a few months off, or I'm going to take a bit of a break from it in some senses. Whenever I initially got into the, I guess, digital marketing space and kind of, early stages in the agency, I think it was a bit of a realization of realizing that where do I have skills or where do I have leverage that I can make money from, and I can do it remotely from Bali, for example. And, a lot of people, I think, there's a few different viewpoints in this, right? A lot of people are very driven towards do what you're super passionate about and, follow your dreams in that sense. If you love fitness, go 100% all in fitness. If you love travel, go in and be a travel blogger, whatever it might be. And for me, it was kind of more so an alignment of, I know that I'm quite financially driven, and one of my big goals in the future is to create kind of financial security and financial independence for myself. And therefore, was kind of leaning into where I had experience and what people were willing to pay me to do. And naturally, my background, I'd spent almost 5 years in Google consulting e-commerce companies on how to run Google advertising. So it was a very natural fit to then work and start assisting and helping e-commerce companies running Google advertising. It was a kind of a no-brainer in some senses, although I would say it wasn't necessarily the thing that, got me out of bed in the morning. That was my biggest, burning passion, that I wanted to run an agency. I would say very far from it. But I guess I realized the potential that it has to be a very strong cash cow business to then fund the lifestyle that I want, and also to kind of create the future that I want to build. But again, man, it was very slow to build up. Like initially, I was just doing consultancy work, so like hourly consultancy work by myself. It was very, and for a long time, I kind of really didn't want to call it an agency, or didn't even want to have an agency. Was very much focused on the freelancer model, make decent income on an hourly rate, didn't need to work too many hours, didn't need to work with too many clients. And I think it was a moment when I realized that although my hourly rate was very good, the consistency of my income was quite bad. And that was whenever I kind of pivoted the model to go into like retainer-based income. So managing advertising accounts on a monthly basis. And therefore you have a consistent income per account every month, and sometimes growing depending on their spend. And then, it was only really last August, September, so coming up on about a year now, that I turned it into an agency, officially registered the company in the US, started to build out a bit of a team around me to actually take on some of the media buying responsibilities. And it was still a very small team. Myself, I've got 3 contractors on board who do a lot of the kind of day-to-day media buying. They're absolute rock stars, to be honest, like all very experienced at what they do. And in honesty, probably much better than me in terms of actually running the campaigns. I'm obviously still very heavily involved from a strategy level and client relationship level. But it's it's a good business model, man. I think anyone that would consider it as an avenue, it makes a lot of sense.
Let's talk through some of the mindsets around it, because I know myself, and when you go into starting a business, and when you kind of come into the idea of, or even when it pops into your mind that you want to be self-employed, a lot of people don't realize the mountain that you have to climb to get through that. And then once you get to the top of that, then there's another mountain again, and it just keeps going in a lot of ways. So what are some of the struggles that you had at the start? Even with, I know for myself, kicking off, imposter syndrome was a huge thing. It's like, am I actually able to do this? Am I the right person to do this for this job? Or can I help out? Am I in a position that I can help people out? And I know I had the backing with my undergrad was in athletic therapy, my master's in physio. I knew I had the backing to do it, but there was definitely still that sense of imposter syndrome where you do have to, I think everyone's going to get it as well. You do kind of have to throw yourself in the deep end and figure your way out of it in a lot of ways. Did you ever come into that? Was that something that ever bothered you as you were transitioning? Transitioning. It's a funny word.
Yeah. I think a lot, man. Like, but to your point there, right? As you said, I would also go back to that point around leverage, right? You had the background and experience and skill sets in that space. So even though it was a daunting thing to go out on your own and set up your business for the first time, you naturally had a very strong sense of credibility, and therefore you had a lot of leverage within that space to work with people in that industry. And I think that was, for me, was very similar. Whereas for me to go and set up the fitness retreat company, for example, I had much less leverage. I had no network in that space, really. I didn't know very many coaches. I didn't know very many gym owners. I also didn't know very many people who wanted to go on fitness retreats. So therefore, that business, although something that I would like to do, I didn't have very much connections in that space and therefore very little leverage to do so. Whereas with the advertising side of things, I had a lot more leverage because my network already knew that I was good at that space, and therefore referral business was very powerful in the early days for getting that set up.
Okay.
In terms of I personally think that starting a business is the best way to force yourself to grow as a person. You undeniably can't. There's nowhere to hide, right? Whereas whenever you have a job, it's very easy to kind of hide away in the shadows to some extent, and you take on the responsibility that you need to, but you don't generally have to step beyond that. Obviously, a lot of people do, and they're ambitious in their drive to take on more responsibility, but it's much easier to hide. Whereas whenever you're doing your own thing, if you're not making income, it's because you're not working hard enough, or because your processes are not good enough, or whatever reason it might be that your business is not operating at the place it needs to be. So you need to force yourself to learn the skills that you're missing on. And again, for me, whenever I ventured into the space, I realized just how many things I wasn't very good at. I was like, yeah, there was certain things that I was relatively okay at. For example, client relationships and sales. That was something that I had a lot of experience in. But when it came to actually running media campaigns, it was an area that I realized I'd advised an awful lot in the past, but I actually hadn't handled the tools very much myself. I hadn't handled large budgets in the past. So there's so many different gaps and things you need to learn. A really big thing for me, I think, that came through was, and one of the reasons I didn't initially want to set up the agency was that very severe sense of potential failure. And that came from that sense of imposter syndrome, which is, if I commit to doing this and it doesn't work very well, I have to accept that that's my responsibility, and therefore somehow that I'm a failure if the business doesn't succeed, and very much attaching my own achievements and my own abilities to the success of the business. Whereas much, much easier for me to sit in the shadows to some extent and say, I'm just freelancing to make enough cash to kind of live in Bali for the next few months until I go on and do my next job. Whereas whenever I took that flip to say, okay, no, I'm actually going to build a business, all of a sudden it's like, okay, now I'm accountable to this. Now I'm going to put it public to some extent to say my LinkedIn network and my old colleagues. And therefore, all of a sudden, there's a sense of like, oh shit, I'm really doing this. And then you've kind of got to lean into it to some extent, because I think that's a very pivotal thing, I think, in general. Whenever you jump in the deep end and you take that step, you kind of have no way out, in a sense, until you kind of give it your all for a certain period of time. And it may or may not work, but you also realize that the reality is you learn a lot more from trying and putting yourself in that situation than from, thinking about maybe doing it in the future at some point.
And what then? Because when I look at myself and putting myself in that situation, I think it's interesting because we obviously have very relatable experiences. But when you, in terms of the business side of things, when I put myself in that situation, and I think, as you mentioned there, you do have to take responsibility for it a lot. If things aren't going right and you don't take responsibility for it, there's really there's no way to look, or there's no way to turn. And I think that's where a lot of people do fail, is that they say, like in sports with a team, this is a huge one that I see. And this is why individual sports suit me a small bit better, is that it's often easier to look at someone else and say it was the referee's fault, or it was the manager's fault, or if it was another player's fault that they didn't play. But in an individual sport, you don't really have that opportunity to look at anyone else. You can't really point at anyone else. And I think in a business, it's the exact same way in a lot of ways. It's like you can't look at anyone else. You can't point at anyone else. So with that, how did you deal with that? What strategies did you use to deal with that imposter syndrome? What strategies did you use to make sure that you were taking full responsibility for it?
Yeah, it's a good question, man. I think there's two sides to it. So one, which I think that you touched on there, is a sense that you're the one who's very accountable to the results and the performance of the business. And with that means that if you're not switched on and you're not performing at your A game, the business generally also isn't performing at the capacity that it could do so. And I think one avenue to get out of this is to try and build a team around you as quick as possible. So therefore, whenever you're not maybe on your A game, there's other people who can pick up the slack to some extent. So like, I'll give a personal example. In the last 2 to 3 months, I would say I've had a little bit of a like maybe lower motivation stage, but more so I've had stress in other areas of my life with other projects. So we've a villa project here in Bali, and that's been quite full on for the last 2 to 3 months. As a result of that, my focus towards the agency business in terms of my LinkedIn outbound, in terms of my content strategy, in terms of just general client relationship work, etc., has probably not been at the level that I would like it to be. But very fortunately for us, our retained monthly revenue has actually increased over the last 3 months because we've had referral-based businesses came to us from other clients that we've been working with who've recommended us based on this performance that we've delivered for them. And we haven't had any clients leave us. So therefore, we have very strong retention and we have new clients coming through based on referral business. And that for me is a position where I realized like, oh, okay, so this has been very pivotal for me. Even when I'm not at the very top of my game, the business is still able to perform at a relatively okay level. And the other point, like in terms of, I don't know, like I think it really is your ability to rebound from those periods as quick as possible. So like it's a lot to do with, for me, the relationship with myself in terms of the internal voice that I have in my head and how I deal with trying to not be too self-critical and not too hard on myself whenever things are not going well, but also be hard enough on myself to have the hard conversation to say, have I been working hard enough, or am I kind of giving myself an out? And this is something I think is very, very topical, because if I was to speak to friends and family, for example, I would think 99% of the time they would say something along the lines of, oh, you're too hard on yourself. But only I know deep down the days that I sit in front of this laptop and I actually scroll Instagram for an hour or two and I don't get to my emails and I don't follow up on a client proposal or I don't do whatever. And therefore, even though I would say in general I'm a pretty hardworking person, there's numerous days where I don't, I'm not very productive or I don't do as much as I need to get done. And only I deep down know that. And I think that's a really big thing in general with everything in life, that we see the highlight reel of everybody's life through social media, and just the way that social media is narrated. Nobody really goes on social media and talks about how shit their day was and how they were super stressed and how this person happened or whatever. Everyone goes on and talks about how beautiful their life is and how perfect their morning routine is, how good their workout was and how good the food is they're eating. And I think it's just very far from reality. So I think it's just a combination of trying to be honest with yourself while also trying to have compassion for yourself. Pushing to your own limits, right? And for me, it's like, I personally have always had a sense of I have the ability to, I have a certain capacity for work, and I know I have a certain potential that I can fulfill. And if I'm not fulfilling that, I generally will feel a little bit frustrated or annoyed at myself. And again, that's maybe not a good thing, in honesty, but it definitely is something that drives me forward in a pretty positive direction in the overall scheme of things.
Do you think it's not a good thing?
No, because it comes from an unhealthy place in general, I would say.
Okay.
Like there's a very interesting quote. I think it's from Ogie who speaks about it, where he says like the three most common traits of highly successful people is they have a superiority complex, so they think they're better than people, or they kind of put themselves on a pedestal. They have crippling insecurities, so they don't feel like they're good enough, or they have a severe sense of inferiority. And they also have impulse control, so an ability to stay focused and on track of what they're trying to do. The first two of those things stem from a place of insecurity and a place of, I'm not good enough, and therefore I need to do this thing in order to get the validation which will make me feel good enough. And you see this in a lot of different facets of life. Like I think one of the best people I actually heard speak about this topic was Johnny Wilkinson on the High Performance podcast. And he talks about the day that he won the World Cup was the worst day of his life. And the reason that is because he put all of his self-worth on his ability to play rugby. And therefore, for him to achieve the biggest milestone that anyone could possibly achieve in their playing career as winning a World Cup, it could only get worse from then, because he attached his self-worth to his abilities as a rugby player. And therefore, whenever he came into the later years of his career and ultimately retired, he really had a loss of sense of self as to who he is without the accolades and without the performance on the pitch. And I think this is very common within sports people, because they generally tie their success and their sense of self to their sporting abilities. But it's also very true in business. An awful lot of very successful business people are driven from a sense of insecurity, a sense of they didn't feel good enough as a child, for example, they weren't validated by their parents, or they were bullied by someone, or their teacher didn't give them the credit that they deserved. And they kind of do it from a chip on their shoulder, which says like, I'm going to prove to you that I'm good enough, and I'm going to prove to you that I'm going to be successful. But the unfortunate thing with that reality is no matter what you do, no matter what you achieve, no matter how much money you make, you still don't internally feel good enough unless you also work on that part of yourself.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important. And I don't know, I do think it's a blessing and a curse, because I wouldn't change anything in some senses, because I'm very fortunate to have some of that ambition and drive that comes from maybe a negative place, but it's also a driving force. But ultimately, I would like to work towards getting to a place where I have a little bit more self-acceptance and, appreciate where I'm at in life, as opposed to always trying to strive for the next thing, hoping that that's going to make me feel better, or I'll feel happy whenever I get there, because that's just a fallacy that never comes true.
Yeah. Do you feel that a fallacy, or do you feel that idea, or even that kind of that way of thinking is happen or develops at different times of your life, in terms of when you're younger, it's in a way, I know it's obviously driven from what would be considered a negative aspect. Is it also good though to have that sense of purpose, that you're working towards something at the same time? Do you know what I mean? Obviously it does come from a negative place, and then as you get older, let's say if you start a family and you have that where you're looking to work on those a small bit more. Well, I know a lot of people who just don't have any sense of purpose at all, and it's not from, like, not that I know their childhoods or anything like that by any means, but they just don't have any sense of purpose or any sense of drive to achieve or to do anything. So as you said, it is a blessing and a curse. Do you still feel though that at this stage of your life, it's in a way, I know self-acceptance is something that I think everyone has to learn, but do you take more positive or more negative from that, or do you just find it as a balance? Do you take more positive or negative from it being a driving force in your life at this stage of your life in your late 20s?
I'm not sure. I think I would like to say positive, but I'm not sure if I fully believe myself if I say that.
Yeah. Okay.
An interesting thing, right, that I think is a certain sense of inferiority is very important, because if we didn't have a certain sense of there was areas to work on and improve, we would never try anything in our lives, right? So, for example, if you look at fitness, it's like, okay, if you didn't think you could get a better 5K time, you wouldn't bother training for it. So therefore, you just accept, I can run a 35-minute 5K and slog along, and therefore it's good enough. As opposed to being like, okay, actually, if I want to be a better runner, I want to run faster, I need to train consistently and put a good program in place and do it over 8, 12, 15 weeks. And that's the same in most facets of life. I think where the danger point is, and this is kind of where it becomes a complex or becomes a challenge, is where nothing is ever good enough. So for example, use a running example, you maybe get to your accolade of goal, you say, I want to run a 5K in under 20 minutes, right? And you run the 5K in under 20 minutes, and all of a sudden you're looking at yourself being like, no, I'm too slow, I need to run it in 18, I need to run it in 17, I need to run it in 16. And it's that sense of like, if nothing that you achieve is ever good enough, if you look at it from a financial term, it's like, all I want to do is make 100K. If I make 6 figures, that's me set. All of a sudden they make the 100K and they think, my life hasn't really changed at all. I still feel the same as I was yesterday. It's the same with the promotion at work. People think, whenever I get to this level in work, I'm going to feel accomplished and, feel like I'm doing well for myself. But the day after the promotion comes, it's a very quick, fleeting feeling. So you have to start to learn to appreciate and enjoy some sense of that process of what you're working towards, which a lot of that comes down to actually doing the right thing, that you enjoy what you're doing and you feel like it's driving you in the right direction, as opposed to chasing someone else's goals that you think is going to make you feel better, when in reality you get there and then you have this sense of disappointment.
Yeah, it does come back to that idea of enjoying the process, doesn't it, in a lot of ways? And I think that's the thing about, like, you can look at it from business or fitness or whatever way you want to look at it. I often talk about jiu-jitsu on this podcast, but for me, jiu-jitsu is a great process right now, because I know, like, I have it in my head that I will continue jiu-jitsu until I get my black belt, and then well into the years after that. That's kind of my goal at the moment. But I know that that's still a 10 or 15 year process to get there. I also know that there's probably, when I do get to that point, there's definitely going to be a sense of, what's the word for it, disappointment in what do I chase next. I have that idea. Like I'm not ignorant to that completely, but I still think that it's knowing that, not setting too much expectation to the outcome, like not saying that, okay, right, if I do if I do win this competition, or if I do get my next belt, or if I do get whatever, as you were saying, to that 100K or whatever way you're looking at it, not attaching to that completely. But in a way, is it important then just to have set another goal for after that, so you don't get attached to it, where it's a constant, you're attaching yourself to the process completely?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like the point you make, I'm actually very intrigued. I've never done jiu-jitsu, and I hear a lot of people speak about it in a very positive light in terms of that sense of the routines that it gives you and the sense of discipline and consistency and effort over a longer period of time. Because again, I think that delayed gratification is a very important part of this process. And therefore, if you're working towards a 10 or 15-year goal, that in itself proves a love of that process, right? You're not going to commit to something for 10 plus years if you don't thoroughly enjoy doing it on a daily and weekly basis and enjoy the sense of getting better. I think that's what a lot of people strive towards, is something that they can consistently improve on, even though in just small incremental amounts over time, and realizing the compounding effect of that over, a 10 or 15-year period. Most people are thinking about what I want in the next year or the next 2 years or the next 6 months. And that's where it becomes very fleeting, where it's these very short-term goals that we're trying to, it's more like a dopamine response of like, I want to get this milestone and then I want to go on again. There's an interesting concept, which is having a never-ending goal, or like something that can't be completed. So, it could be, for example, something like improving the education of disadvantaged children in Indonesia, for example.
Yeah.
Okay, that's something that's, you can continue to improve it over time, but it's never going to be complete. You can always improve the abilities to educate children, improve the teaching facilities, improve the schools, etc. So that's something that can be like an ongoing purpose that you could do for your whole lifetime. And I think if you can try and find something that you resonate with in that capacity, that is way beyond you, it's contributing towards something bigger than yourself, and it also doesn't have a finish date. Therefore, you can continue to work on that for the duration of your life, or as long as that cause is something that is meaningful to you. I think that can be a very useful thing to think about.
Yeah, that's good. Hormozy actually speaks on that as well. He has a name for it. What is it? Where it's like marriage. You don't get a good marriage. You have to consistently have a good marriage or a good relationship. You don't get a good business like out of nowhere, or you don't get to having a good business. You have to continue to improve the process. What is the name for that?
Yeah, like staying in business.
Yeah,
I think he said it's like, it's like the goal of business is to stay in business. It's not to make your first million or your first 10 million. It's to stay in business over the long term, because the same with a marriage, it's the goal is to stay in the marriage, not to get married. It's to have a happy, healthy marriage in the future. And I think it's the same principle to an extent. It's having something that you can continue to build on that's never complete. I would agree in some sense, like of course it's good to have milestones in business that you're working towards, or accolades that you want to achieve. But ultimately, what's the final goal? Like a big thing for me at the minute, like I came from, a background of very little, and something that's always been a desire for me is to create some form of financial freedom. For me, that's not a massive amount of money, but it's enough money that I have enough security in myself to know that I don't have to potentially worry about where my next paycheck is coming from, or how I'm going to cover my rent, or how I'm going to pay for food. And that's again comes from probably where I came from, which, my mom lived in her overdraft, and we never had much more than that. And it was, just a matter of going month to month. So it's always been a desire for me to create enough security that I don't have to deal with those situations in my future. But a lot of that is simpler than a lot of people kind of perceive, whereas everyone's like, oh, you got to get to X, Y, or Z, where it's like, well, really it's a lot more to do with reducing your outgoings, increasing your savings ability, and investing in the right areas that are going to be able to give you passive income. And I think, the ultimate freedom to an extent that I'm personally working towards is if you can get to a position where you no longer necessarily have to work in order to cover the cost of your lifestyle, you can then do whatever the fuck you want.
Yeah.
Whereas whenever you need to work to cover your lifestyle, you have to do whatever you need to do to get that paycheck at the end of the month. And I think if you can get to a stage, whether it be in 3, 5, 10 years time, where you can then focus in on the avenues that maybe really do light you up, but until you've satisfied that first kind of bracket in terms of having enough financial freedom and security, I think it's very hard to go on to the next level. And it's almost like that Maslow's hierarchy of needs to some extent. It's like you can never get to self-actualization if you haven't fulfilled all your initial needs on the way up to get to there. And that for me is the way that I'm currently looking at it. It's like my business ventures are not necessarily the things that I'm the most passionate about right now, but they're levers to get me to a position that I want to get to in the future. And I enjoy the process of doing it. Like I personally enjoy, again, being in business more than necessarily the types of business that I'm running. That makes
Yeah.
sense. I love the process of actually running a business, dealing with cash flow, dealing with finances, dealing with hiring team, dealing with onboarding clients. And that for me excites me more than, say, for example, the Google ads themselves, which is what we actually deliver in terms of the service offering for the agency. It's not to say that I don't enjoy that space or I'm not good at it. It's just to say that that's not where my real passion lies. But I think I need to satisfy a lot of those milestones before I really have the freedom to go into other areas. And again, it's trying to use what I'm creating now for leverage for what I want to do in the future. And I think that what you're doing right now, I find very interesting, which is you're consistently building leverage for your business to sell more products in the future, to onboard more clients in the future. And it doesn't all happen overnight, right? Doing something like a podcast is a very, very long-term strategy to build leverage to people who are going to come. Someone might listen to one of your podcasts and could work with you 2 years later. It's not an immediate sign up of like, this person comes on today. Same with your social media content, same with your newsletters, this kind of stuff. And I think that's where a lot of people are very focused on, how do I get a client right now, as opposed to how do I build my own personal brand and network to potentially open up more opportunities in the future. Like a big thing for me right now that I'm kind of looking at exploring is how do I expand my network into higher net worth individuals for looking into larger investment pools for the real estate development that I'm working on.
Yeah.
My own personal background, I have very limited network or access to capital. Within Indonesia, there's no opportunity to take bank financing or loans. So therefore, everything has to be funded from direct cash investment. At present, that's came from myself, my business partner. We only have limited pools to invest from. So therefore, if we want to expand that business and we want to access larger projects and potentially increase the yields that we can gain from them, we need to get access to larger investor pools. So that for me is looking at things like, how do I communicate what I'm doing effectively, show that we're doing a good job in that space, show that we're delivering good value, show that we're creating good return on investment, and therefore other people will hopefully come knocking on my door saying, Ogie, can you help us do that? Because you've clearly been there, you've done it, you're in the market, you have the market context. We have a lot of capital, we want to invest it in this market, but we don't have the local expertise, we don't have the contacts, we don't have the contractors, the architects, the interior designers, etc. And that again is like where I see the next natural pivot for our business is to go into doing larger scale projects for larger investors. But again, that doesn't happen overnight. That might happen in 3 years' time if I consistently do what I'm doing at a high enough level and play a long-term game. Like a lot of people who are in the property development space here, for example, they're very focused on short-term gains as to like, how can I maximize my ROI or profit on every individual villa that I sell? Whereas something that for us is very important, which is we want to genuinely deliver the highest quality of service for our clients who trust in us to buy a villa from us. An example, we had already sold a villa off plan and we had set the criteria in terms of the furniture and the finishings that we wanted to do in that villa. But halfway through the project, we realized that we could probably substantially improve the quality by increasing our cost by about 20%. That increase in our cost was just a net negative impact to our overall margin. But we know that the final product to that investor, they're going to be much happier with what they receive from us without, they don't ever know that. They don't know that they've got a better product than what we were expecting to deliver them. We know internally that they're going to be happier with the result that they've received as opposed to the initial thing that we had budgeted for. But that, again, that's playing
that long-term
3-year game, right? It's like, we know that that's going to make us less money right now. We're like, literally, we're cutting ourselves 15, 20K per villa less that we could be making in our pockets. But it's thinking, okay, but what's that going to compound to in 3 or 4 years' time if we build a trusted relationship with our investors, they see the quality that we're able to deliver for them, and hopefully that opens up potential future opportunities.
But that is the game, though, isn't it? Like you have to do that. I think, as you mentioned there, like we are looking long term. You're looking 3 to 5 years because people, I think we forget how fast and how fleeting that is. How fast the years go. Like it's been a year since or more since I was with you in Bali. At least, it's been over a year. So when you think of the time frame, on a day-to-day or on a week-by-week basis, things seem like, oh Jesus, that's so far down the line. I need this now. Like I want this right now. And I am the worst, I would say, for it. Like if I want something, I want it now. Like that's the way it is. But I do understand that you need to play that longer term game in a lot of ways. But I think that's when it does come back to the process of all the stuff that you mentioned there. You understand what the outcome is. You understand what the goal is. But then it's the coming back to it and enjoying it on a day-to-day and finding the little goals on a day-to-day. I think that's so important for people. Once you know what the outcome is, or once you know what you're trying to get to, like the podcast for me is I just really enjoy doing the podcast in a lot of ways. I've done a lot of them at this stage, but it is more obviously there's what I when we go into like a lot of the health side of things and the injury and recurring injury side of things, there's a big aspect there that draws people to it because they're dealing with it and they want to know how to fix it. But at the same time, if I could sit down and talk to people about anything. Like I grew up in a pub, so I used to sit just inside the counter of the pub talking to people about anything, and I think this is the closest that I can get to that. But it can have
Yeah.
the conversations are a bit more meaningful in a lot meaningful in a lot of ways. For the stuff that you go into and the stuff that you talk about, I don't know how you can how do people improve that skill in a way of delayed gratification though? Is it obviously discipline comes into play? A lot of people rely on motivation for things, but is it a skill that can be improved, or do you feel that you're kind of you are where you are with it? Do you know what I mean? The delayed gratification I'm talking about in terms of like, do you feel that's something that people can improve on, or how did you improve on it in ways? Because I'll talk about a small bit about how I did, but I think it was it's a process is really what my focus is. Do you feel that's a skill that can be improved?
I would say 100%. Like, I don't know, a big thing for me since moving here actually has been the difference in some of the things that I value, or not even necessarily that I value, but also that the people around me value. And therefore that naturally changes your own perception to what's important, right? And I'm a really big believer that your network and the people that you surround yourself with have a large impact on what you want and where you are in your life, right? So for example, when we look at delayed gratification, if you're living in Dublin, for example, right? So I use the example of I used to live in Dublin for 4 or 5 years, and a lot of my friends at the time were looking at buying, nice houses in Dublin. They're dropping 5, 6, 700,000 pound or euro on a nice 2 or 3 bedroom home in Dublin. And if you're sitting there in Dublin, a large part of you thinks that's what I need to do.
Yeah.
And this is not me saying that that's the wrong thing to do. It's me saying that everyone should have their own independent views on where they're at in life and what's important for them, depending on their goals and where they want to get to. The same comes down to, on a more simple level, it's how you spend your time and how you spend your money. So a lot of people are very focused on material objects that will give them a certain sense of status. And again, there's no denying that we all play status games, and status is probably always going to be a part of how social hierarchies and society is made up at large. But you can choose the status games that you enter into and that you choose to play. If you're deriving a lot of your value from the car that you're driving, or the watch that you wear, or the clothes that you wear, or the restaurants that you eat at, naturally enough, you're going to end up spending money on those things. And where that becomes a challenge is if you can't necessarily afford those things, but you're buying into those avenues in order to perceive a certain sense of success or a certain sense of lifestyle, in the hope that that brings other people to you who maybe also have those same values and see those things as important. It's very easy to find yourself in a position where you end up being quite stuck, where you're spending pretty much everything that you earn to upkeep a certain lifestyle that you want to be perceived as having, when in reality you maybe can't quite afford it yet. And there's two sides to that. Some people might say, oh, we'll fake it till you make it, and that'll get you access into the networks of the kind of people who are in those spaces. But I would say on a more realistic or rational term, it's much easier to look at getting the lifestyle you want in the future by being more frugal in the short term and delaying that gratification. As don't spend everything that you earn to show everyone how much money you have, and actually look at trying to save as much as you possibly can while still living a decent lifestyle, right? I really disagree with the sense of like, completely skimping and not enjoying the things that you enjoy. For example, if you enjoy going to a nice restaurant and having a nice meal, don't force yourself to eat chicken and rice 7 days a week because it's cheap and effective. Go and do the things you want to do, but within reason, and set a feasible budget to say, okay, what do I want to save? And also evaluate what are the things that are important. Like for me here, for example, I live in a very basic house and pay very low rent. I don't really need a fancy home to live in. I have a nice room, I have air conditioning, I have Wi-Fi, I have my monitor set up here, and that's kind of all that I need. I get to go out to beautiful beach clubs at the weekends and sit on nice sun loungers and lounge by nice pools, if I want to do that, because they're all accessible here and they're all very affordable. But I don't need to have that in my home life. And again, same like, for example, I pay for a very nice premium gym membership. It's still not anything crazy expensive, but for Bali standards, it's probably way more than I need to spend on a gym membership. But that for me is a large part of my community. It's where a lot of people that I network with, where a lot of my friends go to, and therefore I'm willing to spend on those areas. But I cut back quite substantially on other areas. So I think it's just trying to find like where are the areas that are important for you that you want to spend on that you actually get value from. Don't limit yourself on that cup of coffee you enjoy in the morning just for the sake of saving the £2. But maybe do limit yourself on going on 7 holidays a year and driving around a new car on finance that you can't afford.
Yeah, that's a great point, man. That's an excellent point, I think. Of looking at things that you value most and working into them. How do people stop that though? Because I think the insecurity of not having something and seeing someone else have it, and knowing the thing is, in a way, like when you look at social media, that they're fronting in a way that they're not actually living that lifestyle. That they're fronting, but there's still an attraction to it. There's still a draw to it. So I think people who are in that situation, I think let's look at in Ireland, right? I'd say half of or not half, let's not put a statistic on it, but when you look at Ireland, one of the main things I notice when you move outside of Ireland is there's such a strong drinking culture in Ireland. And there's such a high levels of poor mental health in Ireland. Like there's so many people struggling on a day to day. Yet everyone feels that you have to be out all the time at the weekends. A lot of people our age feel that you have to be out all the time. You have to be drinking. And then they're wondering why everything is for the next 3 to 4 days. They're feeling like shit, while they can't keep up with the habits that they want to do, or they can't keep up with the lifestyle that they want to live in ways. But it's that fear of FOMO, I think, or of fear of missing out for a lot of people that really affects them in ways. But is it because they value, like, what's driving that? Is it their value of community, the value of that they should be out with people, that they should be able to afford that lifestyle? What's driving that culture so much? Because when you look at it from the outside looking in, obviously you can look at the States and you can say, all right, money drives a lot of the culture. A lot of people are trying to drive bigger cars and live in bigger boxes and stuff like that. But in Ireland, it seems to be for a lot of people that they get stuck in the cycle of drinking and going out every weekend. And what do you think is driving that? Like, is it a community thing? Is it do you think, I don't know, is it to say that it's an insecurity thing? Because I doubt it is an insecurity thing across the board. Why do you feel that at home? Because in Bali, it's not as much of a thing.
Not as much, but I think it is still a frequent thing in most parts of the world. Like I would say, even in Australia, it's quite similar. I would say here to some extent it's similar. And also, if you notice, for example, a lot of Irish who are here, they naturally fall into the same habits or routines when they are here.
Yeah.
I think a big thing that I've seen or that I've kind of analyzed in myself is it generally comes down to, it's the sense of community. It's a feeling like I want to fit in. I want to have people to be around. And therefore, if everyone's going to the pub, I'm naturally going to go to the pub with them. And I don't want to be the one weirdo who's having a sparkling water because all the lads are going to slag me and tell me that I'm a pussy. And that's literally the reality of it. We've all grown up in an Irish culture that is very, I would say, loose in terms of how we treat each other. We're your best friends are the people that you probably abuse the most.
Yeah.
And I think that can be very good in some ways, but also it can bridge over a barrier where it can become a real challenge for a lot of young men who don't have the courage or confidence to step away and have their own sense of self and be able to say no because that's not what they want to do. A big thing that comes to mind is a sense of like there's a pain in every situation, and it's which pain that you want to choose. Is the pain of staying the same versus the pain of change. And if that pain of staying the same isn't too hard, like if that pain of where you're currently at is not like literally putting you in a position where you have no other choice than to have to change, you simply won't do so. And it's until that pain of staying the same gets to a point where it outweighs the pain of changing that you might finally actually take action. And I think if that does happen, which it does happen for a lot of people, it generally comes to reaching rock bottom. And that's something that no one would wish upon anyone. But sometimes the best and biggest transformations for people do come whenever they reach rock bottom. And therefore, potentially, it can be an important place to get to. Yeah. I think an easier way to change, because if you live in the same place and you have the same group of friends and you're in the same circle that you've always been in, it's very, very hard to change within that environment because the environment's not going to change. And it's very hard to pretty much create a full new social circle in a place that you've been for a long time. So I think one of the easiest ways to make that change is actually to take yourself out of the environment and put yourself in a new situation. But the most important thing is when you get to that new location, for example, is that you actually become the person that you want to be and you don't fall into the patterns that you know very well that are going to get you liked and make you fit in. Because I think a lot of people have a desire to change and they really want to create better habits. They want to reduce drinking. They want to get fitter. They want to get healthier. They want to focus on business. And they move to a new location, whether it be Bali, whether it be moving to a new city, whether it be going from Dublin to London. And whenever they get there, they naturally feel a bit lonely and they feel a bit isolated and they feel a bit out of place. And the easiest thing to do is do what you know, because it's, you can go to the pub on a Friday, you'll meet 4 or 5 other Irish guys, you'll have a few pints with them, and all of a sudden you'll be mates. And then next thing you know, the following Friday you're meeting up again, the following Friday you're meeting up again. And the next thing you know, you're in the exact same pattern of routine that you had in Ireland. But you're now in a new city doing the same thing, probably also still with Irish people because you haven't expanded that social circle. So I think it's a very challenging thing to do. I think it definitely can happen, but you need to, yeah, you need to essentially face the pain of change, which is not an easy thing to do. Like I personally have gone through 2 or 3 periods like that in my life where I've drastically changed my environment, and it's generally very lonely and it's very isolating and it's quite painful to go through. Ideally, on the far side of that pain, there's a bit of solace and there's a bit of kind of self-actualization to some extent of like, oh, this is where I want to be and these are the kind of people that I want to be around. But very often that takes a long time to get there. And sometimes you never get there. You end up just being in a place of like, I'm not really finding anyone that I resonate with. And all of a sudden I've just, created my own changes and habits, and I might be fitter and healthier, not drink as much, but I no longer have a good social network.
Yeah.
And your social network is probably the most important thing that we need in terms of community for feeling, I guess, pretty connected and content as humans.
Yeah, and it does. It's definitely an isolating feeling, and that even comes back to that idea of delayed gratification. Because when you're talking about the feeling of change, the pain of change needs to be more than the pain of not changing. Is it the pain of not changing? Is that what's the quote exactly? Just so I have it right.
Pain is staying the same.
It's pain is staying the same. So I think when you look at delayed gratification as well, that obviously has to play into it, because a lot of people, and that I know as well personally, and I think it's across the board for us all, is very easy to, when the pain gets too much or the pain that it feels like you should change, it's very easy to do something small in the moment, like go out and just go drink. And I'll deal with that on Monday. I'll deal with that on Tuesday. And then Tuesday rolls around, you still exact same, comes all the way around to next Friday night and you do the same thing. And I can see it is a cycle that people can get away with doing that for a lot. Now, talking about hitting rock bottom, I know you mentioned it there. What was it that contributed to you hitting rock bottom mostly, if you don't mind talking about it? What's up, guys? Robbie here. I hope you are enjoying the podcast so far. I want to take a moment just to personally ask you for your help. If you're enjoying the podcast, would you be willing to share it with someone you think would love it too? Maybe a friend, family member on social media, or even if you just brought it up in conversation with someone you know. The recommendation means the world to us, and it's because of people like you that we get to be able to produce this podcast on a weekly basis. So thank you so much for your support so far, and I would love if you could help us reach even more people who could benefit from it too. Really appreciate you, and we're going to jump straight back to the podcast.
Yeah, I don't mind, man. I'll give you some context. I woke up in a hospital bed in full restraints. Arms and legs were strapped to a bed in a psychiatric ward. And that was probably one of the most traumatizing days in my life to this date. And that came after, in honesty, I'd let my life spiral into a very negative place for probably 2 to 3 years, where I was drinking way too much. I, started smoking weed at a very young age, smoked very heavily, 16, 17, 18. Started drinking very heavily quite young. Started taking class A drugs quite young. And I found myself in, I think it was my first or second year of college. I'd went to Spain for a summer. And pretty much after a week solid partying, I had what's known as like a psychotic breakdown. So a psychotic episode, which is where it's quite a severe mental health challenge. In my situation, it was drug induced, and very often is in young men in particular. I found myself spending 10 days in a psychiatric ward, heavily medicated to try and reduce the symptoms of the paranoid, delusional, negative, depressive thoughts that I was going through. And honestly, I'm very, very fortunate to be here, and the sense that I had friends that brought me to hospital before I did something stupid, because it was at a stage where the thoughts in my head had became so real to me that I didn't think there was another option other than to take my own life, to be very honest.
Okay.
And it's something that it's a very challenging thing to come to terms with, because in my conscious mind, I don't think I ever wanted to do that to myself. but due to the nature of that condition and how severe it is when it comes on, it's quite challenging to really explain, because unless you've experienced it, it's very hard to really understand how your brain can even get to that point of thought patterns. But essentially, psychosis is like if a lot of people who suffer with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or bipolar disorder will experience frequent psychotic episodes, often once or twice a year or more frequently, depending on the type of mental disorder. I very fortunately, wasn't diagnosed with a severe mental health disorder, and fortunately, it was more of an acute episode based on the lifestyle factors that I was putting myself or putting my body and mind under at that time in my life. And it was one of those things that, as much as it was a very challenging thing to go through, it was also one of the most pivotal, positive turning points in my life, in a sense that I had to acknowledge and accept that the lifestyle that I was living was not very conducive to my own health and habits and routines that I wanted to be at. And I think the biggest thing for me, being very honest, was it came back to looking at not ever wanting to do that to my mum. My father sadly passed away when I was very young, and he committed suicide. He did suffer with quite severe mental health challenges. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder a couple of years before he passed away, and he took his life when I was about 3 years of age. So it's something that is, it's very, very challenging for our overall family, and mental health has been something that's really been, I guess, a real challenge for us all of our lives. And I think I never really fully came to terms with what he was going through until I went through that experience when I was 21 years of age. And I think at that time, something that severe happening and you being so close to potentially doing something that you can never reverse, all of a sudden you kind of question everything in life, and you question, what you're doing, who you're surrounding yourself with, the habits that you're entertaining. And it definitely wasn't an overnight change by any means, but it was probably over the space of 2 or 3 years, through going to speak to psychotherapists, by going to counseling, by doing cognitive behavioral therapy, by also kind of beginning to research and learn an awful lot about the mind, about mind-body connection. And that's kind of, in honesty, where I kind of refound a love for exercise. I'd always been very active as a kid, played a lot of sports, but for those couple of years, I kind of just pushed them to the side, and kind of partying and whatnot took over in that sense. And I think it's been something that I try to speak about openly, because I personally think it's a very important conversation to have. And I think a lot of people tend to speak about mental health in a way in society where there's a lot of people talking about, oh, it's okay to not feel okay, and it's okay to feel low, etc. But there's still very little support for people who are actually dealing with challenging times, and there's also very few people who are able to kind of, I guess, communicate and effectively understand what a lot of people are going through. So for me, it's been a big part of, I guess, the last 8 to 10 years of my life is trying to normalize that conversation around mental health, and something I've done a lot of in terms of speaking publicly at certain events or on podcasts or whatever else, because I just think, it's a very, very scary place to think of how dark the mind can go. And it's something, to be honest, like I very fortunately haven't had an episode like that in about 8 years, but I also haven't taken drugs in 8 years, and I've completely changed the lifestyle that I was living back then, and very, very fortunate for it, because in honesty, everything else that's came from there in terms of the things that I've done in my life, none of it would have happened if I hadn't changed those habits and routines. So therefore, going through that event in that period of my life for those couple of years where I was in a very low place has ultimately been the kind of driving force behind the change that I've made to put myself in a better position in the future. But the reality is the challenges still come up, and there's still there's still a negative voice in my head. I think that appears at times, often more frequently than I would like it to be there. But I think in general, the kind of habits and routines that I have in my life help me deal with that a bit more effectively than I used to be able to. And thankfully, the lows don't seem to stay for as long as they previously did.
It's I can only imagine the experience itself. Is it something that when you were on that trip, was it something that obviously it had been something that you had dealt with for years before that? Was it building up to a point, or do you feel that on the trip when you went away with your mates and you were, let's say you were partying for a week or so, that it was just one day that the switch flipped? Do you know what I mean? I guess what I'm trying to do is, for the people that are listening, is that something that you feel that can just happen out of nowhere? Or do you feel that there's certain things? I know you were saying at the party and that. Did you know when you look back and when you reflect on it, can you see different events of it happening, building up to that point for even weeks to months before that?
Not that much, to be honest. I think in that situation, it's quite different to say like a slow, like depressive period that maybe more people would be able to relate to. Like psychosis happens to about 1% of the population. So it's a relatively rare thing to occur and quite a severe thing to happen. In that situation, there potentially was some build up to it in terms of the lifestyle that I was living, but I think it was more so the environment that I was in. And I think, I think it honestly, since I've talked about it, you'd be surprised how many people have also had similar experiences also abroad, because I think whenever you're in a foreign country, your brain naturally is more susceptible to the kind of risk factors of things that could go wrong, because all of it, you don't have your home comforts to some extent. So I think it was a combination of a number of those factors. And another big one, there's definitely potentially a genetic disposition there from my father. So I think it's a combination of lifestyle that I was living, things I was consuming, and also some genetic disposition. In honesty, the period after that was probably the most challenging, because whenever you've gone through that, you're almost like, I don't ever want to have to experience that again. And if I do have to experience that on a regular basis, I don't really know how I'm going to manage to live a very normal life. And a big fear for me at the time was that I would have to be medicated for a long period of time or forever, in order to kind of manage the potential risk of going into one of those periods again. And I did spend a number of months on medication, but fortunately, again, haven't had to take it for the guts of probably 8 years since that time in my life. But I think afterwards, what ended up kind of occurring was going into a very negative, depressive cycle, because all of a sudden you lose a sense of, to be honest, a bit of hope, sense of hope for the future, and a sense of like everything just feels like it's a bit of a catastrophe, and you don't really. At the time, my bigger fears were like, I don't think I'm going to be able to finish college. I don't think I'll be able to do my exams. I don't think I'll be able to hold down a full-time job in the future. I don't think I'll be able to have a family or have kids in the future, because the severity of what I went through felt like if I was to go through that with a job, you couldn't work. Like you literally couldn't work.
What age are you when it happened?
And I was 20 or 21, I think. So I had two episodes, one in Spain and then one the year afterwards, both very, very similar. And it was after the second episode, I guess, where I guess a lot of things had to change, or there was no real option.
And with the second one, then what was it was it a similar situation? Was it a similar build up to it happening, or was it more of a just out of nowhere?
The second one was a little bit different, but it was a combination of similar triggers. Like it was a combination of lack of sleep, high stress, and also partying and taking illicit substances. So I think it was our end of year ball in GMIT, and the week afterwards was where I kind of it was funny because it happened before, I kind of felt it coming on, and I felt like I could control it, or I could prevent it from happening. And initially it was like little kind of stints of kind of paranoid delusional thoughts where I thought someone maybe had taken my laptop or had moved something or done something in my house. And I kind of identified it as like, oh, this feels very similar to the initial kind of like slightly paranoid or delusional thoughts that started happening the year previously. But yeah, essentially it spiraled from there, from kind of me thinking that I had it under control and that I knew what was happening, to just, the kind of thoughts that go through your mind are pretty outrageous to even consider, to be honest. Just like, essentially, I think the easiest way to try and explain it is it's almost like an episode of The Truman Show, where you feel like the whole world is watching you, but in a very negative context. Like I felt like there was pretty much an army of people with guns outside my house waiting to shoot me. And that was fully real in my head. So it was, just like wild kind of thoughts that clearly are so delusionally far from the truth. And that went on for about a month. Like I was pretty much locked in my house for the guts of a month, dealing with these very severe, negative, depressive, delusional thoughts that people were coming to kill me.
Well, and is it obviously you can't exactly in that situation you can't reason with yourself? How do you come out of it at the end? Does it pass with time? Is it something that was?
Both.
Sorry, guys, we had technical difficulties there for a second. In that situation, Oak, what was it that ultimately led you out of it? Was it something that had to pass with time? Were you able to reason yourself out of it? Was it speaking to people? I heard you mention medications. What else contributed to that?
Initially, it was mainly medication. So I was on like antipsychotic medication for the guts of probably 2 to 3 months. It took about probably 2 to 3 weeks to come out of the very severe period that I was in, and then it kind of normalized to some extent, and then it was a lot of therapy after that. I went to a lot of kind of cognitive behavioral therapy to understand thought patterns. I think one of the best things I did actually was after that episode, I went to see a specialist in Ireland who kind of specializes in that space. And he kind of gave me a lot of assurity, which was like, you don't have a problem. You don't have a mental health diagnosis. You have simply had an acute episode or two based on the lifestyle that you're living. And he was like, it's a very simple solution. You change your lifestyle, you change this happening to you again. And I think that was the real deciding factor where I was like, okay, I need to make some quite substantial changes in my life. And again, that was one of those periods, where I kind of relate back to in terms of it was probably very painful at the time because a lot of my social circle, became maybe not very positive for me to be around. And again, it was nothing against those people necessarily or what they were choosing to do. It was that I simply couldn't engage in those environments, and I simply couldn't do what those people were doing at the time because it wasn't very conducive to my health, and therefore I had to remove myself from those environments. And yeah, it was relatively challenging at the time, but I think I managed to try and turn it into a positive to some extent, and use it as a bit of a motivation factor to try and speak more openly about mental health challenges. And I started doing some talks in college the year afterwards, and end up setting up like a non-profit organization to try and assist and help other people who were dealing with mental health struggles at that time in their life. And yeah, it's been a journey since then, man, to be honest. I haven't had periods like that since, very fortunately. But it was definitely, I'd say that for me was definitely where I kind of hit rock bottom, and had to have some very hard conversations with myself, to be honest.
Yeah, it's still it's stigmatized in Ireland so much still, and maybe in the cities it's a small bit different, but out the country in GA clubs and stuff like that, there's still an element of stigma around it. I guess in Argentina, I think it has the highest per capita amount of psychologists. And it's such a common thing here. Like the lady that I do Spanish lessons with, like that's something that she'll talk about. Oh, today I went to my psychologist earlier on, and we chatted through this, and then this was the rest of my day. While in Ireland, I don't know anyone who would say that I went to a psychologist earlier on today, or I went to a psychologist last week. It's frowned upon in a way. It's not frowned upon. That's probably the wrong wording, but I think a lot of people still feel that I don't know if it's internal or external. A lot of people still feel that, I know anyway, that it is a sign of weakness in a way for men. Is that something that you may have come into as you were going through it? Is that something that you would have felt yourself? I only noticed because, not that I noticed, but in terms of the clients that I deal with, that's a common perception. If I ever recommend that maybe you should talk to a psychologist, it's like, no, I don't need that. I don't know. I'll figure this out myself. Is that something that you've come into or you've come across?
Yeah, 100%. I think, definitely in Ireland, probably more so than a lot of places. It's something that there's definitely been a lot of positive work in Ireland over the last number of years where people have talked about mental health awareness, and people like Prezi, for example, have been big advocates for it. Well, I still think when it comes to someone actually struggling, there's a real disconnect between the large scale media coverage that people are talking about mental health as it being okay. And there's a lot of charity runs, there's a lot of work that Pieta House and these organizations are doing. But very few people still feel okay about going to actually use those services, even though they're more vocal and more people are speaking about it. And I think that's where there's an interesting, I guess, change that still maybe is occurring and still needs a lot more work, because I think individually within people, there's still a certain sense of stigma that's attached to it, that people, for example, think that it would impact your performance in a workplace, or that they think it would impact your ability to have relationships, or they think that, maybe it wouldn't be good to be friends with someone who's dealing with those issues because they're going to be negative to be around. So I think for those reasons, people are still very afraid to actually speak about it when they're going through it, even though there's lots of like large scale media coverage. On an individual level or within friendship groups, there's still a lot of kind of taboo, or still a lot of stigma to some extent of like, oh yeah, but that doesn't happen to our kind of people, or that's for, and that's something that in general I think is a big challenge within the mental health space. Is it's generally assumed to be a problem for poor or people from low socioeconomic backgrounds. It's a big misconception. There is some evidence to support it, in the sense that yes, people who are in less privileged positions are more likely to suffer from mental health issues due to the natural stresses of being in that environment. If you're struggling to pay your bills and you don't have a job, and you're maybe have alcohol problems or other issues that are in those environments, naturally speaking, you are more likely to develop mental health challenges. But it's definitely not something that is only for people who are coming from lower economic backgrounds.
Yeah.
People from any walk of life can deal with and struggle with their mental health. And if anything, like personally, it sounds like mental health as a term, there's a spectrum, right? There's people who have mental health disorders, which is generally speaking a very challenging, debilitating thing to deal with, that often does need medication or often does need extensive therapy and treatment just to live with that condition. However, there's a lot of people who go through periodic challenges in their life. Anyone who's ever lost a loved one, for example, will have felt a sense of lowness, which could be very similar to a depressive period, but it's fleeting and it passes over time, and therefore it wouldn't be classified as depression. It would be classified as low moods, for example. But everyone has felt the feelings of that. For example, anxiety is something which is, in some senses, can be a good thing, right? Getting anxious before doing something, it means something to you, or it's important to you, and therefore naturally we're going to become a little bit anxious and worried about it, which often forces us to prepare a little bit more. But it's whenever it becomes a real challenge, when you can't function in your day-to-day life without the fear of having a panic attack, for example, that it becomes a generalized anxiety disorder or something that's a real challenge for you to live your life with. And I think there's a very big deciphering factor between the two. And a lot of people group them into the same bracket, where they say, just mental health. And mental health is multifaceted, and there's so many different avenues to it, and different levers that are required for people in different spaces. But yeah, I think there is definitely still a stigma. I think it's almost like trendy and cool to put on your social media story, like, World Mental Health Day, and support each other, etc. But whenever a friend actually needs help, people are maybe not as supportive or encouraging as they could be, and therefore people don't often go and seek the counseling or support that they need, because they're afraid of the judgment that might come from it.
But in a way, is it something that people aren't as supportive because of the judgment that would come from it, or is it because that they want to promote it, but when somebody comes to them, they don't know what to do? Because you mentioned there that the mental health services, that there's a lot of funding, the darkness into light, there's a lot of funding going into them. But when you say the mental health services, like, what is that? Like, what is that on a base level? It's not going into your GP, or it's not going into the hospital. Like, that's more severe cases. How can someone interact with the mental health services on more of a what's the word I'm looking for? How can they interact with them on
access?
Access, yeah. How can they get more access to them just on a base level?
And honestly, my knowledge of the Irish system is not very, very in depth. Like, there's obviously a lot of very good private therapists, but they're very expensive in general. I think they're very worth what they charge, but it's not a very affordable thing for a lot of people. It could be £100 to £200 or euro per hour, and that's obviously a lot of money to fork out to go and sit and speak to someone about your problems. But I would say probably arguably the best investment that you could ever make in yourself, and probably will be the most impactful use of your money, than, for example, going and dropping that £100 in a pub on a Friday night. But in terms of the mental health services, like there is like obviously through the HSE is a natural avenue, right? If you go and speak to your GP, they might not be an expert in mental health, but they should be able to refer you to someone for an assessment. Unfortunately, in Ireland, there generally is quite long waiting lists. It can be from 6, 9, even 12 months. Like, I was seen through the outpatient services in Galway for a number of months after that kind of period of my life, and it was definitely helpful. But again, I definitely got more from when I went privately and invested in kind of an expert in CBT, and also worked with private psychologists. And that was more so, they were more available and accessible, even though it was more expensive. They could be used immediately, as opposed to having to wait 6 months to see somebody through the HSE services. But man, like, I don't know, I'm a big advocate to say that it's a massive sign of strength and courage to be able to ask for help. And I think it's something that more people should feel empowered to do so, because the reality is, do you really want to sit in a place of misery for the shame of your own ego, and the sense of like, I want to be man enough, or I don't want to be seen as someone that's not strong or powerful enough to deal with my own issues by myself? It's like, look, none of us are experts unless you train in that area in understanding your mind. And I think it's kind of diluted how we put so much time and effort into developing our physical bodies, and we spend so much time training and exercising and looking at nutrition, but we spend almost nothing investing in our minds. And I think it's probably the most important avenue to understand how our brain functions, how it operates, how to really understand ourselves, how to process our thoughts and emotions. And it's just a very, very powerful thing, because if you can understand your mind, you can also understand what's holding you back from different situations in life, whether it's challenges in social settings, whether it's challenges in business, whether it's challenges in relationships. They give you the tools to actually unlock and process those things and push yourself forward. Like, I personally think that investing in yourself in general is probably the most important thing that you can do. And I think it is kind of crazy how much people do spend on going on nights out, on buying new clothes and buying new cars, but they won't go and spend money on seeing a therapist or hiring a coach or hiring someone to support them through that journey of whatever they're trying to go through. Like, I'm a big advocate that we should probably have coaches for every area in our life that we need. You know, for example, you work with people in terms of injury rehabilitation and other areas. Like, if you have a problem in an area, why struggle through it by yourself when there's an expert there who knows how to help you get to where you want to get to, and they have all the solutions and answers, and they're going to hold you accountable to get there. You know, it's something that I personally invest an awful lot in. Like, even in my week to week here, it's like I'm paid to go to a recovery specialist once a week for like deep tissue sports massage. You know, I pay a nutritionist who does my nutrition work and my meal plans. I pay a fitness coach who does my fitness plans. I pay a business coach who helps me, navigate my business challenges. And they're all investments into my own personal growth that I think are a very important part of me trying to become the person I want to be in the future. And it's like a sense of like, I don't have everything figured out. Very, very far from it. I'm consistently trying to work on things, understand myself better, understand my drives, motivations. I think, like investing in therapies. Like, I've recently been seeing a therapist doing more hypnotherapy work, which is something that I hadn't done much in the past, but it's actually kind of going back to process some of the subconscious challenges that we maybe have that we aren't able to deal with on a conscious level. So speaking to a general therapist, we're often just talking from a kind of a conscious level as to what we can rationalize or understand. Whereas when you look at the sense of like what's in your subconscious and going into kind of a deep hallucinative kind of a hypnotic state, you can release a lot of different kinds of trauma that maybe it's not much harder to process and work on a normal talk therapy basis. Again, it's not for everybody, and some people might hear that and think, oh, that sounds very out there or a bit strange or whatever you might look at it. But there's been one or two of those sessions that have been very, very transformative for me in terms of going back to deal with that sense of loss of my father, in terms of that fear of abandonment that came from losing him at such a young age. And how that showed up in my life, in my relationships, even in the workplace, even with friends, etc. And therefore, it's like, okay, do I want to stay, just putting on the blinkers and trying to keep going forward and not assess or address the fact that clearly there's some trauma there that I haven't fully processed or dealt with, even though my day-to-day life is pretty okay right now. I think it's very important to go back and look at, okay, now I need to work on some other stuff that's maybe a little bit deeper or more challenging to actually process and might take a longer time to actually deal with. But it's a process of trying to work through it.
Yeah, it's a process. It does come back to that, isn't it? And I think that on the point that you made there, to go back to it, you were saying that it's a sign of strength to reach out and to talk to people, and I would agree with that 100%, because you have to take responsibility for the elements that you need help with in life. And it's the same thing as you just mentioned there with your nutrition, with your business coach. Like, there's certain elements there that, okay, you can try get through it yourself if you really want to expedite that process or speed it up. If you really want to get the outcome that you want to, I think you need to reach out to those professionals in a way. I also think that what you mentioned there is you need to have a good financial stability to do that. So what in Ireland, when we talk about the mental health services, one thing I saw in Bali, now I never actually participated in it, but the guys used to have it. They used to hold a men's circle. I don't know if you've ever been involved in one of those, which when I look back on it now, I can see it being a thing that's going to develop and become a more prominent in the society in a lot of ways. But it's on a base level, and a lot of people that I work with as well, it's like, well, what I promote them to do, or say, if you can look at maybe organizing a few people that you get together and go down with a swim with, go down into the sea and go down and have a community, something that you all do together, and that you can at the time as well maybe open up and talk about that with your friends about how they're getting on. It doesn't have to be about you all the time. Sometimes you feel the best helping other people in ways as well. And I know you mentioned that with the charity side of things, because I know you do a good bit of work with charities over there in Bali as well at the same time. But is there something that people can do on a base level when the mental health services in Ireland are so slow to help people unless you're in more of a severe place? Is there anything that you know of that helps people to access those services on a day-to-day, or something that you found it yourself that helped you, that may not be specifically financially that you have to pay for it, something that even if it was a community you joined, if it was just a habit that you started to work on, is there anything that you feel that helped you to get through it that wasn't involved in the health service specifically?
Yeah, look, 100%. I think they're the tip of the iceberg, and the majority of it comes down to your own daily habits and routines, to be honest. Like it's obviously great if you can afford to pay for those specialists to kind of push you on to that additional level. And sometimes in a place of crisis, for example, therapy is a very important thing to get you out of that
Exactly.
crisis stage. But in a general day-to-day life, I think a lot of it comes down to like how we live every day, right? And the points that you mentioned, I would completely resonate with. And I think it's in general, it's not really spoken about enough, but I think men really struggle, I think, more so in this capacity than women, because women are much better in general at meeting up and talking about things in general. It's much more acceptable for two girls to go and just grab a cup of coffee or go for a walk or do whatever. Whereas men often find it a little bit more challenging just to meet up for the sake of meeting up, for the sake of checking in on each other and being like, oh, how's your week been going? Very often, again, it revolves around going to the pub for a few pints. That's kind of the most
Yeah.
easy way for men to connect and meet up. And in some senses, there's some solace in that, right? And that's where it's not always a bad thing, but unfortunately, there's generally negative connotations that come with that, which is the hangover and maybe the depressive moods that come as a result of it. So if you're not in a very good place already, and your only form of solace or connection is in the pub, naturally then the rest of your week is going to be an even lower place where you're feeling even worse about yourself, and maybe the rest of your habits that you had been building up often fall off by the wayside. So I think it's really, really important to try and form some form of a connection or bond with other men, and do activities with them. So, for example, whether it is going for a dip in the sea, whether it's going for a gym session, whether it's even just going for a lads' dinner one of the evenings during the week, these kind of things. Which again, I would say, yeah, being here in Bali is much more open to those kind of things. Like going, for example, we used to go to Amo Spa where you go and do ice baths and sauna. That's very often where you go with two or three of the guys.
I missed that,
You're
man.
missing that one. But those things are really important, right? And like I think again in Ireland there's maybe less of it because the weather is not as conducive to being outdoors, and therefore it's a little bit more challenging to get out and do some of these things. But it really is very important. Like connection is probably one of the most important parts of us feeling somewhat okay in ourselves. If we're lacking connection and community, it's very hard to feel fulfilled and content, even if the other parts of our life are in a relatively good place. So I think finding a sense of community in something, and often that might be pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. So, for example, I was chatting to someone earlier on. He mentioned like Pat Dibley, for example, in Ireland, does a lot of
Yeah.
kind of meetups with men. He does like breathwork sessions. He does kind of men's coaching groups. And again, some of them are paid, but a lot of them are also free groups and just networks that he offers for people to kind of come together in that capacity. And there's more of it happening in Ireland in general. But if there's nothing happening in your area, like be the person to create it. Be the person to say to the guys, "Oh, hey, do you want to go and jump in the sea or the lake on Friday, and we'll go and grab food afterwards," as opposed to just always being like, "Oh, let's go and watch the football and have pints on Saturday."
Yeah.
Um, the outside of the community and connection side of things, I think your own relationship to yourself is very, very important. It's something that I've done a lot of work on in the last couple of months, which is this concept that is like keeping promises to yourself and doing the things that you said you would do. And I think if you do this consistently enough for a long period of time, you begin to build a lot of self-respect for yourself, and you turn up and you are the person that you want to be, right? And that's kind of the process for me. Is like, if you say you're going to wake up at 8 a.m., wake up at 8 a.m. and get out of bed and go and do what you need to do. If you say you're going to go and jump in an ice bath in the morning, go and jump in the ice bath in the morning. And it doesn't have to be, a lot of people often try and put together like, oh, I need to do these 20 things in the morning. I need to do everything on my list to feel like my day is in a good place to go forward. Pick one or two things. Like it might be as simple as, for example, putting your phone on airplane mode, waking up on your first alarm, whatever time that might be, 7, 8, whatever time you wake up at, but just sticking to what you say you're going to do, as opposed to a lot of people like, oh, okay, next week, normally I wake up at 8 o'clock, get out of bed, go to the gym, whatever. Next week, I'm going to wake up at 5 a.m. every day. I'm going to do 20 minutes of breath work. I'm going to journal. I'm going to jump in the ice bath. I'm then going to go for a walk and get morning sunlight. And then I'm going to, do whatever, red light therapy, whatever people are doing. It's so much to take on, right? And it's like, this is so unachievable. And like, if you've never woken up at 5 in the morning before, what makes you think that all of a sudden next week you're just going to turn it on like that and want to get out of bed at 5 in the morning? You're going to say, fuck that. You're going to be tired. You're going to turn your phone on to snooze, and you're going to turn over and sleep for 2 hours. And then you're going to wake up and think, I'm a failure. I'm lazy. I didn't do what I said I was going to do. I'm not hardworking. I'm not disciplined. I don't have the resilience that I need to have to be successful, whatever that self-talk might become. And I only say that because I'm someone that personally has a very negative internal voice an awful lot of the time. So I'm trying to consistently build a bit more compassion for myself, but also don't let myself off and don't let myself, just slack off and not do the things that I need to do. So I think that's very, very important. And like finding something that actually worked for you. I personally find ice baths one of the most powerful things to like shock my nervous system and put me into a state of like, okay, let's get on with the day. Like nothing else kind of wakes you up or makes you feel as alive as spending kind of 2, 3, 4 minutes in a 5, 6 degree ice bath first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
And again, that doesn't mean you need to go and buy some fancy ice bath. Get an old whiskey bar or an old bathtub and throw a lot of ice in it and a bit of cold water. Like Ireland is cold enough generally that 1 or 2 bags of ice will get water to a pretty cold temperature that it's going to shock your nervous system enough to wake you up. And there's even some very interesting studies. I've seen Huberman was talking about it recently, where it's like a 2.5 increase in dopamine for up to 4 hours after you do an ice bath, which is
Yeah.
pretty incredible release of dopamine, which is like
Is
a lot of
yeah.
people say that.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, I have a point on that. Go.
No, I was going to say it's very similar to the dopamine that people get from cocaine, for example. It's like if
Yeah.
you can get that natural high or release, whereas it actually wears off much quicker from substances or drugs. Whereas an ice bath is a very natural thing to do that can really boost your overall mood for up to 4 hours after you do it. It's like clearly that's a very good thing to do. Right? Clearly
Pubs
that's going
started
to put you in a better
introducing ice
headspace for
baths.
the day.
Pubs started introducing ice baths out the back just to let lads dipping out, jumping into the ice bath, coming back in. I think there's another. I think there's another element to ice baths though, and that a lot of people probably don't acknowledge as much. And there's because I love an ice bath as well. That's one thing about Buenos Aires. We were talking about it before. The sauna culture and the ice bath culture is not a thing here. It's very difficult to find any place that has an ice bath at all, and to find there's not really that many gyms that have saunas or even just hotels and stuff that have it. But on that point, I think that a lot of the benefit that comes from an ice bath is the fact that there's no one that's really says like right before you jump in the ice bath, like, can't wait to do this. Like, this is exactly what I want to do. Like, I couldn't think of putting myself in any better position right now. But once you're able to control yourself, once you're able to control your emotions and then put yourself in there, and when you come out of that, the sense of there was no fucking way that I wanted to go in there before it. And then I've done it and I've come out, and now you get that increase after. I think that so much more power comes from that than the actual cold water itself. The cold water obviously is a tough
100%.
one, but it's the having the mental strength to say, I really don't want to do that right now. Like, there's nothing else. I know for myself when I was at home over the winter there, me and I said it to my father, we'll whatever, we're going out for a swim in the sea, and he was like, oh yeah, we'll swim in the Turlock, it's closer. And so we kind of got in a good habit of doing it. But I remember there was no real morning that I woke up that I was like, Jesus, I cannot wait now to go down, and I can't wait to go down now and swim in the freezing cold water in the middle of the winter. But once you do it, the sense of accomplishment, that's probably the word I'm looking for, it's kind of the phrase I'm looking for, the sense of accomplishment after you do it, knowing that it's something that it's a short-term thing, you really did not want to do that going into it. I think that plays over into so many more aspects of people's lives. And I think the ice bath itself gets a lot of publicity now because a lot of people are doing them, but it's really, it's that mental strength. I think it comes back to that idea of developing some serious sense of resilience to be able to control your mind. And it's delayed gratification in a way. It is a small bit.
I would 100% agree. I think that's a big part of it. Of course, the facts to back it up can be beneficial, and that can also motivate people to do it because they know there's a benefit of doing it. Because as you said, no one wants to do it, so they have to be like, well, why the hell am I doing this? So therefore, the benefit can kind of motivate people to give it a go. But I would 100% agree with you. It's like I'm very fortunate. My neighbor has one outside his place, and it's pretty much on every morning. So therefore, it's like, okay, I generally do 3 minutes, right? And you're like, there's nothing that can get in the way of doing 3 minutes. Like, it's such a small space of time in the scheme of things in your day, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, I've always got 3 minutes. Even if I get up a little bit later or whatever it is, like, mate, you've got fucking 3 minutes. Get in the ice bath. But I agree, it's that process of doing something that you don't want to do and then giving yourself the credit for like, fuck, I just did a hard thing. And if you do it early in the morning, I guess like you did a hard thing to start the day. Therefore, you feel like you've got a bit of momentum and motivation to push on. Look, some people would say that they don't need that. And if you don't need that, that's amazing, right? I'm not saying this is something that I think is very interesting. There's a lot of people online that will kind of put this like, oh, if you need to have your morning routine, you need to do ice baths, you're not the kind of disciplined, motivated person that you need to be. And you should just be able to, like, I'm always very big on this, that I actually disagree with him a lot, where he's like, just get out of bed and get on your laptop and start working, like start grinding and start working. It's like, look, mate, if you want to do that, all well and good, but don't take away from the fact that a lot of people get a lot of solace from having a bit of a routine or ritual that helps them get into that headspace where they can function at their best, because maybe everyone doesn't have the same sense of really strong, positive, motivational voice in their head. Some people have a negative internal self-critic who tells them you're not good enough, you're lazy, you need to work harder. And by just taking 1 or 2 steps to push yourself out of your comfort zone, all of a sudden you're like, oh no, I actually am resilient. I am hardworking. I can do things that are hard. And the ice bath that you said personifies a lot of those things, even though it's a very simple tool in itself. The other thing that I'd add on this, and it's something that I was actually just kind of journaling about the other day, I had a thought in my head, which was whenever we do anything, we kind of have three choices, right? We either give up a little bit early, we follow through what we said we would do, or we give an extra 10%. And that for me is a very interesting thing to think about, because the gym is a very easy example to look at, or running, for example, which is, say, for example, I set out to do a 5K, right? And you're on the road and you're running and you're like 3.5 kilometers in, you're like, you know what? I'll sack it off at 4 kilometers. I'll finish up at 4. At least I've got out, at least I've done a bit of a run. And in some sense you say, yeah, that's fair enough. You've got out for a run. But internally, you've just lost a little battle in your mind. You've lost a little battle that says, I was going to do 5 and I did 4. So even though I've gone out for a run, psychologically, you've came back with a loss. On the flip side, you finish your 5K, I would say, look, that's very fair. You've done what you set out to do. You've given yourself the credit. You set out a goal and you've achieved it. But if you take that one step further to give yourself a little bit more of a push and say, do you know what, actually, I'll crack on and do 6 kilometers, for example. Or in the gym, for example, instead of being like, you know what, I'll finish up a rep early, like not push for one more rep. Or in the ice bath, instead of being like, okay, I'll finish up at 2 minutes, push for 2 minutes 30 and knock up those little wins where you know you can do them. And all of a sudden, because where any incremental gains in life comes is through that additional, 1, 2, 3% effort. It doesn't come through, doing 50% more, but doing 5 or 10% more, all of a sudden compounds so significantly over time. And that for me is something I'm trying to lean into at the minute, is like, push yourself that little bit harder. I tend to personally, I would say that in times I would give up myself a little bit early, whether it's in a workout or whether it's in a run or whether it's whatever in life in general, that I'll work hard enough, but I'll maybe just fall a little bit short. I'll give myself a bit of like, it's okay, don't worry about it. We're starting to be like, no, push to do at minimum what you said you would do, but ideally even push a little bit beyond that again to give yourself that like, fuck, you actually are, you're pushing even harder than I thought you could. And that really builds, I would say, that mental resilience or toughness to say, any kind of challenge that you can push on. Like you can go to the extremes of David Goggins where he goes and runs 120 miles a day, but take it into the small avenues of your own life and think what's realistic or achievable. And maybe it's, pushing out 11 reps on the bench press instead of doing 9.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point, man, to kind of draw this podcast to a close. And one thing that I wanted to follow up on is what you had said, to making promises to yourself is so important, isn't it? And following through with us, because I think when people lose self-respect for themselves, it's very easy just to not do the thing that they said they would do. And then you don't go to the gym, you skip the gym this night. And then I skipped it last night, I'll take a day off. Like I noticed this a couple of weeks ago, I got sick with being in Egypt. I got basically staph at jiu-jitsu, and then I got bursitis, and I never took care of it properly. And because I was gymming and I was trying to keep because I had such a good routine going, I was trying to keep it all going. And then it basically turned into kind of like a level of sepsis that I had to go to the hospital and take the antibiotics and all. Anyway, stupid idea, wouldn't do it again. But I know once I had pulled back from it, I was out of jiu-jitsu for maybe 3.5, 4 weeks. And I can remember on the Monday skipping the session and be like, I'll go to Tuesday. And I remember the Tuesday skipping the session and then being like, oh no, I'll definitely go on the Wednesday. And I had to catch myself in that mindset of like, you've been making promises to yourself every day to get back to this. You know it's going to be a big barrier. You know the first session is going to be the toughest session back. Like you've already agreed to that. So why don't we just get through that? Now do we know, like we've consciously already understood that it's going to be a lot harder. We have to face it at some stage. And it was only when I broke that I was able to come back. And I think there's a lot of power in laughing at yourself. I think there's a lot of power in when you catch yourself saying something like that, that you shouldn't be doing it. Instead of trying to beat yourself up over it, laugh at yourself and just say, like, because everyone's obviously only human. I think there's a lot of power in that. And once you do understand that, okay, there's going to be a significant barrier here to overcome for the first session back. And once you get over that and you come out and you kind of have that little laugh, my God, the self-respect that you have for yourself after it is powerful. Like you stand with your chest out, your shoulders back. You're so much more confident in yourself. And then that's literally it. It's just one step in the right direction can build that momentum to continue on. And I think a lot of people are afraid to take that first step because they've set so many barriers in their way. I don't know if
it goes both ways, right? It's also, I 100% agree, man. I think it's very, very powerful point, and it's both ways, right? It's you, as you said there, you acknowledging yourself how easy it is for you to also slip back into that potential of not doing what you said you would do, and how easy it is to allow yourself to stay in that position. And I'm sure a lot of people are in that position where it's like, oh, I'll start the gym next week. I'll start on Monday.
Yeah.
Instead of just be like, go today. Or everything, diet, nutrition, exercise. There's so many things in that where it's like it's easy to push off and not do the thing that you wanted to do or you said you would do. And it ultimately leads to a position where you don't respect yourself and you don't hold yourself accountable. And you begin to potentially go into a negative spiral of both thought patterns, but also physical kind of connotations of where you end up going with in your life. So I think it's very, very powerful, man. I think the more promises you can keep to yourself, while setting realistic and ambitious promises, but the more that you can keep to yourself, the more respect that you build, and ultimately the happier and more, I guess, content you'll be in life.
Yeah, I think that's perfect, Doug. I think we should, all in all, I think we should leave it at that for now on the podcast. I really enjoyed having you on, man. Thanks a million for jumping on. Obviously we talked about the business at the start, and then we got into the weeds of everything else. But I guess, where can people find you if anyone wants to reach out? I know maybe talk about your specialty, what you work in specifically, and then as well, if anyone has any questions on even the other aspects of it.
100%. I'm not massive on social media, but LinkedIn is probably the best place to get me when it comes to the business, and that's all focused on e-commerce, Google advertising. And when it comes to just following me, I don't put up too much, but Ogie Hollywood on Instagram, a bit of stuff around the villa builds that we're doing here in Bali, and a bit of just general lifestyle stuff. But reach out if anything resonated on the podcast or I can help with anything. I think I'm always happy to jump on and share if anything's helpful. Feel free to reach out.
Nice. That's perfect. Thank you very much, man. But that's all from us today, guys. I appreciate you all listening in, and we will chat to you all again next week. Have a good one. Okay, guys, thank you so much for listening to today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you're looking to learn more about what we do, as well as check out any of the mobility and rehab programs we have available, just head over to the description of this podcast and you will find a link to all the programs there. As always, thank you for listening, and I will chat to you all again in the next episode. Have a good one.